So last week, Pastor Scott started the series, The 12 Stones, and he showed us God's faithfulness and what it looks like. And we're going to be continuing that today and looking at God's faithfulness just a little bit more. One of the things I have learned in my time of doing youth ministry, it's very important for the youth leaders to know the influence that they have over the students they're working with. I remember several times in my first ministry, Katie would smack me on the back of the head because I would say something and I was joking, and then the teenagers would go and do it because they thought, hey, that sounds like a good idea. Caleb said to do it. We even had that last week at Exalt for Youth Group on Wednesday. I said I thought flossing was a conspiracy theory, and the kids went, I'm telling my parents that. I said, that's not what Caleb said. But it is important to remember this. And I remember one time at a youth retreat a long time ago while we were still in Bible college where there was a student in one of the cabins up at the church camp, and he had stacked about 8 or 9 mattresses on the floor, and he was on the top bunk. And I jokingly didn't think he would do it, but I was like, you should roll off and see if you land on the mattresses. So he, before I could say stop, had rolled off and landed on the mattresses, which thankfully he landed and didn't just go sliding off and hitting a bunk. He was safe, but his youth leader was not too impressed with me at that time, which is funny now because now we're friends. But sometimes I think we can all struggle with knowing the importance of faithfulness. Like these students I talked about, they had faith in me and that I was knowing what I was talking about here, whether I was joking or not. And we can get distracted sometimes. Sometimes it distracts us from knowing the importance of faithfulness, or we have difficult situations pop up in life and we forget about the importance of faithfulness. So today in our scripture, we're going to be looking at the story of Gideon, starting in chapter 6, to kind of bring this home just a little bit more. So if you have your Bibles, please open up to Judges chapter 6, story of Gideon. So as you're doing that, I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of the first 10 verses just to start. If you've read the book of Judges, one of the things you'll know is Israel lives in this cycle of life. And that cycle of life is they would first rebel against God. They would go and they would worship idols. They would do whatever they thought was pleasing in their own eyes. And as a result of this, God would allow for one of their neighbors or a foreign entity to rise up and oppress them for years on end. And they would come in and it would just be horrible. And eventually Israel would cry out to God asking for help. And God would help them, they would overcome, and then after a time of peace, Israel would go back and rebel against God. So here in Judges chapter 6, this is what's happening. Israel has rebelled, and this time it is the country of Midian. And they come in, and for 7 years, God allows them to oppress Israel. They made it so that Israel struggled to grow food. The Midianites would wait for the Israelites to grow their crops, and then they would come in and they would see it, they would eat it, they would steal it, they would destroy it. They would go after the livestock too. They made it nearly impossible for Israel to eat. So reading in verses 5 and 6, we see it says this of chapter 6. For they would come up with their livestock and their tents. They would come like locusts in number. Both they and their camels could not be counted. So that they laid waste to the land as they came in. And Israel was brought very low because of Midian. And the people of Israel cried out for help to the Lord. So Israel finally gets to the point where they cry out to God for help, and he does help them, and he's going to choose Gideon to be their judge or leader. In verse 11, we read this. Now the angel of the Lord came and sat under the terebinth at Ophrah, which belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, while his son Gideon was beating out wheat in the winepress to hide it from the Midianites. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him and said to him, the Lord is with you, O mighty man of valor. And Gideon said to him, please, my Lord, if the Lord is with us, why then has all this happened to us? And where were all his wonderful deeds that our fathers recounted to us, saying, did not the Lord bring us up from Egypt? But now the Lord has forsaken us and given us into the hand of Midian. So here we get to see our first look at Gideon, and as we read it, at first it's not quite the best impression. The first thing we see is he's working the wheat in the wine press instead of out in the fields because he's scared of the Midianites. So instead of being above ground, we find him in the wine press. Back then it was usually underground. So he's underground hiding from the Midianites, growing the food. And so probably easy to say he's a little bit of a coward here. And all of a sudden this angel comes and shows up and calls him what? A man of valor, or a brave man. So it's a little interesting, right? Like how do we deal with this passage here? So one of the points here for us today that we can look at and that's really encouraging for us is that God calls us to be who he wants us, who wants to make us if we will let him. So God calls us to be those he wants us and if we will let him. So God has a plan for us. If we let him work in every part of our lives, he will make us into what he has planned and knows what we can be instead of what we choose. Here he sees what Gideon could be instead of who he's being at that moment. God sees the bigger picture, and just like we are about to see him help Gideon become this man of valor. We're going to skip over to verses 14 and through 18 right now. And it says this, "And the Lord turned to him and said, 'Go in this might of yours and save Israel from the hand of Midian. Do not I send you?' And he said to him, 'Please, Lord, how can I save Israel? Behold, my clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my father's house.' And the Lord said to him, 'But I will be with you, and you shall strike the Midianites as one man.' And he said to him, 'If now I have found favor in your eyes, then show me a sign that it is you who speaks with me. Please do not depart from here until I come to you and bring out my present and set it before you.' And he said, 'I will stay till you return.'" Now we're going to jump down to verse 36. It says this, "Then Gideon said to God, 'If you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said, behold, I am laying a fleece of wool on the threshing floor. If there is dew on the fleece alone, and it is dry on all the ground, then I shall know that you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said.' And it was so. When he rose early the next morning and squeezed the fleece, he wrung enough dew from the fleece to fill a bowl with water. Then Gideon said to God, 'Let not your anger burn against me. Let me speak just once more. Please let me test just once more with the fleece. Please let it be dry on the fleece only, and all the ground let there be dew.' And God did so that night, and it was dry on the fleece only, and on all the ground there was dew." So here God is telling Gideon that he is going to be with him, that Gideon is going to be the instrument of his will in a few different things that are about to happen in Gideon's life. And both times we read in these passages, Gideon hesitates and is not sure. One of the things it reminds me of a little bit is as the boys have been growing and getting older and their food is changing and we try to give them kind of different options for food, they're a little bit picky. I think they get that from their mom. There was too many laughter going on. You don't all know my eating habits. But we've had many dinners where we tell them to try food and that it's good. But they adamantly believe that if they eat that food, they could die. And we show them, we'll even eat it and show them that it's not toxic, that it's actually good, and still they're not sure that they believe their parents. And I think it's a little bit similar here. Here in this passage, we see Gideon doing this a little bit with God. We read this and look at Gideon like, how can you be this way? You got God right here. The God of the universe is literally telling you very clearly, I am with you. I don't know about you, but I think that'd be pretty comforting if I heard God directly speaking to me saying I'm with you instead of having a little bit of that faith. And we see Gideon is being told this, and he's still not sure. And this is where I want to take us with our next point today. And God is patient with his children, even in their times of doubt. Now, this is one of those things that God does for us that should be very encouraging to us. God is patient. His patience is incredible. I know for the times for Katie and I, when we have these moments with the boys and their food, our patience is not infinite. We are to a point, we get there to a point. We will be there, we'll be encouraging, we'll be nice, but eventually after about 30 plus minutes of having your child argue with you, eventually you hit a point where that patience just stops. And unfortunately, a lot of times we let that frustration start to seep in, and the situation gets worse for everybody. But it's a good thing God is more patient. He knows us better than we know ourselves, and he is willing to wait for us even when we doubt his plan. And so Gideon goes on, and he gets to do some things. And as we look in chapter 7, we read probably the most known part of Gideon's story, where he is now gone and assembled the army for Israel and God decides that there are too many soldiers. Now at this point we can know, and as we read, the Midianite army is huge. In one of the passages we read earlier, it talked about their number being too great to count. And if you look in chapter 8, you can see that the Midianite army was over 100,000 men when they did a count. And so here in chapter 7, there are 32,000 Israelites with Gideon, and God says that there are too many men for this to be his victory. Now, this isn't really the normal military response of a commander, right? You're going up against a force of 100,000, and all of a sudden you have a much smaller army, and your commander goes, that's too many people. It's too many soldiers. But normally you want as many soldiers as possible, but God has a plan here. So he tells Gideon to give the men with him a choice to stay or go home. And then at this point, 22,000 men go home, which leaves Gideon with 10,000. And God looks at this and says, there's still too many men with you. So then they go, and he gives them another test to drink in the river, and it says that the men who drank like dogs were to go with Gideon, and God used them, and they numbered 300. So all of a sudden, you went from 32,000 to 300 against 100,000 plus soldiers. Not very good odds. And from there, God uses this tiny, and I'm not sure we can really call it an army, but it is his army in the situation that he chose to bring about victory in his name. And they do it, and they proceed to cause chaos amongst the Midianites when they chose to attack at night with the torches and the jars that they had, and he chose at the time where it was a switch in the watch. And all of a sudden, the Midianites start attacking each other and killing each other. And God uses that chaos, and you read this, and this little tiny army of 300 were able to defeat this huge, massive force without really probably any casualty to the Israelite army. And so we see this, and he has a plan, and there's a little more with Gideon's story after this battle. You would think that everything would go great for Gideon after getting to experience God the way he did, but it doesn't go that way. He gets a little bit of a big head afterwards. One of the tribes of Israel that was not included in the battle was upset, but they were very wealthy, and they were upset with Gideon, and Gideon kind of tried to make the situation better. But then there was another two tribes. They weren't as wealthy, but they caused a little bit of problems for Gideon, and he did not treat them the same way. Another thing that he did, probably the biggest thing that he did that was a bit of a mistake, was after the battle, he took loot from all of his soldiers, golden rings, and he made a golden ephod. And an ephod is an article of clothing that was only supposed to be worn by the tribe of Levi. And he is not a Levite, and it was a special thing for just the priests. And Gideon goes and he makes his own. And he does this, and he makes the golden one, and it's one of the spoils from the Midianite army. And it talks about that in the passage that Israel is constantly jealous of it, and it causes problems for Gideon and his family afterwards. And after Gideon dies, they had 40 years of peace, and it goes back to Gideon dies, and his son rises up, and he was not a good guy. And it says that, again, the Israelites stopped doing what God asked them to do and went back to doing whatever they wanted to do. And over again, the Israelites and Judges, we see they turn from God. And then they get oppressed, and then they cry out to God for help when it gets bad. And it's interesting that whenever God helps them get out of trouble, they love him and they remember his ways. Then after some time of peace, they forget him until things get bad again. And we need to remember that the problems we face don't come from God or even the things around us. A lot of the times, they happen internally. The choices we make, the people we allow to influence us, not turning to God for what he wants in our lives. The Israelites were constantly turning away and causing their own problems themselves. They were choosing to go after other idols. They were choosing to do these different things and turn away from God. And their problems were not a result of the other countries. It was them doing it. And it's amazing that the things that they do, that over and over again, God would come to their rescue. And this is my final point for today, that God is actively pursuing us. He could have given up on his people many times, but he loved them, and he still loves them, and he loves us too. He is actively pursuing us just as we need, if we just let him work in our lives to be the people he knows we can be, we will see who God really is. He is a loving God. He is a faithful God who wants us to be his children. Will you pray with me, please?